All right, guys, it's 9:30. Let's go ahead and get started today. Let me share the right screen with you. We're going to be doing a little lecture on Of Mice and Men, going over some of the study guide stuff. So there you see it on the screen, Of Mice and Men study guide. They're basically all the same. Every chapter has some vocabulary you might need to know, and ignore the pages because the page numbers are supposed to go with this book right here, but since we're reading it online, it's a little different. All right, so Of Mice and Men. Let's talk about the author real quick. The author's name's John Steinbeck, and he's widely regarded as one of the most influential voices in American literature. He enjoyed a comfortable middle class upbringing in and around Salinas, California. That's up north, just south of San Francisco. He was the son of a schoolteacher and a local politician, and he spent his summers as a young man working on nearby ranches and migrant farms. It was this experience that provided him with the material for some of his most famous work, including Of Mice and Men, The Grapes of Wrath, and East of Eden. Steinbeck studied literature at Stanford, but didn't graduate. And in 1925, he moved to New York to pursue a career as a writer. He struggled to get published in New York and then returned to California in 1928, where he and his wife humbly lived while receiving financial support from Steinbeck's parents throughout the Great Depression. Steinbeck published his first novel, Cup of Gold, in 1929, and in the 30s hurtled to success as the chronicler of both California history and its contemporary struggles through fiction and nonfiction. There's an anti-capitalist, pro-worker sentiments are really in the forefront in a lot of his work, most prominently displayed in Grapes of Wrath, although we can see some of it here in Of Mice and Men too. At the time, he made a very controversial figure, and he drew the attention and the ire of the CIA, the IRS, and J. Edgar Hoover. He won the 1962 Nobel Prize for Literature, and he's been inducted into the California Hall of Fame for his work. And it's hailed to this day for its realism, its empathy, and enduring socio-political relevance. Historical context: following World War I, about 1919, crop prices really fell hard, and that forced farmers to expand their farms and to buy more equipment to make up for the lack that they were getting the prices. So the same amount of corn or grain was worth a lot less than it was before, so they had to make more of it. This situation got worse when a drought crippled much of the American West. The stock market plummeted in the historic crash of 1929, so these farmers who were already struggling, and the lives of their farm workers, it just grew really a lot worse quickly. When the market crashed, farmers couldn't pay back the debts they had built up buying more land and equipment. As a result, many farmers and farm workers migrated from the Great Plains to California in hopes of finding enough work to live. Laborers often worked for horrible wages without the support of unions or the stability to know if they were even going to have a job in the future. Families were ripped apart. At the same time, strange new allegiances were made, such as the intense but difficult to describe bond between Lenny and George, our two main characters in the novel. So, Steinbeck wrote a lot about the American Great Depression. He has a couple other novels, In Dubious Battle and Grapes of Wrath, that stand kind of beside Of Mice and Men, and this is typical of Depression-era literature. It represents the gritty realism and unforgiving social atmosphere of the Great Depression. There was a guy named Woody Guthrie. He's an American songwriter. He chronicled the Depression from another angle, releasing these things called Dust Bowl Ballads in the 40s. The album sought to give voice to the poor and disenfranchised people and laborers that were living in the Dust Bowl, which was the great area in the Great Plains caused by this drought it wasn't fertile and there wasn't anything growing, and literally dust storms would just blow across it and blow all the topsoil away. So it was called the Dust Bowl. Many novels that are written during this time really seek to explore the political, economical devastation of the Depression and its lasting effects on our society. Young adult novels like Esperanza Rising, which many of you may have read, deals with that. Bud, Not Buddy. They explore the period through the eyes of children that are swept up in this chaos and the uncertainty of the times. But beyond its historical context, this novella empathetically details the struggles of several physically and mentally disabled characters, which was really uncommon for its time. If you've read like Flowers for Algernon or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, they feature complex and nuanced characters who are also dealing with mental disorders. But this was like really one of the first ones. Like, we all know something's wrong with Lenny, right? We just kind of don't know what. And it's never really defined. So, pioneer in that case. It was written in the 1930s in Salinas. It was published in 1937. It's a novella. It's not an actual novel because it's so small. And its setting is Depression area, Salinas and Soledad. And let's go ahead and get into it. If you guys want, I know that there are a lot of places for you to find readings of this if you want to listen to it together. Just go to YouTube and we're going to type in Of Mice and Men. Alright, so if you go down here, you don't want to rent the movie, and if you want to, say chapter 1. There we go. I bet you Aaron Dickey right here is actually reading it for you. So just click on those. Look at, here's Of Mice and Men audiobook chapter 1. I'm going to drop this link in
Of Mice.
Share, copy. I'm going to drop that in Teams so that you guys have access to at least the first chapter. Like I did last semester with Night, I'll drop the couple chapters in here. Let's talk real quick about work and when it's due. You're going to have a quiz on Monday on chapters 1 and 2. Your work will be due then. I will be checking it that day. You will have the rest of the week to do chapters 3 and 4, and you will have a quiz on Monday again on chapters 3 and 4. We don't go to school on Friday because it's the Independence Day holiday next week. We get the July 3rd off. So you'll have a quiz Monday on 1 and 2. A week later, you'll have a quiz on 3 and 4. And then a couple days after that, you'll have a quiz on 5 and 6. Our last day is Friday the 10th. So we're going to be wrapping up things by then. All right, let's get back to Of Mice and Men. So, stage and screen, Of Mice and Men has been widely adapted into plays and films. The first theatrical performance took place in 1937 at the Music Box Theater on Broadway, while the novel itself was still on the bestsellers list. Notable revivals of the play, there's a 1974 Broadway production which featured James Earl Jones as Lenny, and a 2014 production featuring James Franco as George Milton. The novel's also been adapted for the screen twice, once in 1939, and that one garnered 5 Academy Award nominations, and then once in 1992. The title, Of Mice and Men, is important. It's drawn from a poem by Robert Burns that's titled To a Mouse on Turning Up Her Nest with the Plow, November 1785, which features the line, "The best laid schemes, O mice and men, gang aft angly." The poem describes the speaker's shock and regret upon realizing that he disturbed a mouse's nest while he was plowing a field. The speaker tries to assure the mouse that he means no harm, while at the same time lamenting the unpredictable nature of the future and the futility of planning ahead. Gang aft angly is a Gaelic phrase, and it translates to go oft awry. Okay, so the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, which means they don't always pan out. Steinbeck uses his own novel to show the devastating effects of these future plans that go horribly wrong. All right. So, George Milton and Lenny Small, they're two itinerant workers from Auburn, California. They make their way across the state's harsh landscape on their way from one ranch job to another. As they close in on a job just outside the town of Soledad, they stop for the night. Okay, and that's kind of where we pick up. So in the slow cooling evening of a hot day just south of Soledad, two men arrive at a warm green pool out the Salinas River. The area around the pool appears still and lifeless. There are tracks from rabbits, raccoons, lizards, and other animals, and an ash pile left behind by the fires made by ranch hands and tramps who frequent the pool. The first man, George, is small, thin, and quick with his restless eyes. His companion, Lenny, is a huge man who moves like a hulking bear. Steinbeck begins his novella by placing his two main characters in the midst of a bustling wilderness whose appearance is deceptively still and calm. It suggests that George and Lenny are up against forces of nature, both within themselves and around them, and will have a reckoning with these forces sooner or later. Lenny runs to the edge of the pool and begins drinking from the surface in huge gulps. George reprimands Lenny for drinking the questionable water, reminding Lenny that he was sick from doing the same thing just the night before. Lenny insists the water is good and urges George to take a drink. George samples the water and admits that it seems potable, but tells Lenny he should never drink stagnant water even if it looks all right. Right from the beginning, this passage establishes that George must look out for Lenny at every turn, since Lenny doesn't know or can't remember which things are safe and which things will hurt him. George is clearly frustrated by the constant burden of having to monitor Lenny's actions. George complains that they have had to walk over 4 miles in the heat after their bus driver let them off the highway in the wrong place. Lenny shyly asks George where they're going, and George, kind of upset and a little hot, reminds him that they're on their way to find work at a nearby ranch. When George reminds Lenny of how they secured their work, they got their work cards, Lenny becomes worried that he has lost his and searches his pockets for it. George reminds Lenny that he himself has Lenny's work card. This further delves into the complete dependence on George and expands the small burdens that George faces in caring for Lenny that just slowly add up over time. When Lenny keeps one hand in his pocket, George becomes suspicious and asks what Lenny's holding on to. Lenny reluctantly tells George that he has a dead mouse in his pocket and insists that he found it dead. George demands Lenny hand over the mouse, and Lenny reluctantly does so. George tosses the dead mouse into the bush and asks Lenny why he would hang on to such a thing. Lenny replies he enjoys petting its soft fur. Lenny's obsession with soft things and the unfortunate ways it gets him into trouble is one of the novella's defining metaphors. Lenny doesn't know his own physical strength, and his warmth and affection ironically lead him to crush the things he loves or otherwise get himself and George in trouble. George tells Lenny that when they arrive at the ranch, Lenny is to keep his mouth shut when the two of them meet with the boss. George goes over the plan with Lenny again and again. George then reminds Lenny that he must not do any bad things like he did at the last job in a place called Weed. Lenny, however, seems unable to remember what bad things George is talking about, and George laments that if he didn't have Lenny with him, he could get along so easy and so nice. Okay? Again, George's constant need to remind Lenny of the events of their past, as well as the demands of their future, wear on him. He struggled to keep his temper in check when Lenny forces him to revisit painful memories or repeat anxiety-inducing plans about their future. Dusk begins to fall, and George announces to Lenny that the two of them will stay by the river for the night. Lenny asks why they can't go ahead to the ranch, where there will surely be supper waiting. George replies that he knows work on the ranch will be hard and wants to take advantage of one last night of freedom. Lenny asks what they'll do for supper, and George replies that if Lenny gets a fire ready, they'll be able to cook some cans of beans George has left in his bindle. Lenny says he only likes beans with ketchup, but George tells Lenny to stop fooling around and gather firewood. This passage establishes George's desire for freedom from work, the demands of others, and from the constraints of his itinerant lifestyle. Lenny is obviously he doesn't have to worry about these things, right? But he thinks he wants more than what they have too, and it's very indicative of the American society's general mood during the Great Depression, as people yearn for better opportunities and economic security promised by the stereotypical American dream. Lenny runs off into the bush and comes back with some firewood. George tells Lenny to hand over the dead mouse he collected from the bush. Lenny reluctantly hands over the mouse, insisting he wasn't going to do anything bad with it. He was just petting it. George tosses the mouse into the brush once again and then washes his hands by the pool. Again, it's clear that Lenny accidentally killed the mouse due to an underestimation of his own strength. Lenny's obsession with soft things is profound and unshakable. And moreover, as this passage shows, Lenny is determined to outfox George in pursuit of clinging to this powerful preoccupation. Lenny begins crying. George tells Lenny to stop blubbering like a baby and agrees to let him keep a fresh mouse if he finds one. Lenny says that he used to know a woman who gave him mice to play with. George tells Lenny that that woman he's remembering was Lenny's own Aunt Clara, and that she stopped giving them to him because he killed them all. Lenny says that if the two of them had rabbits, he'd be able to keep them alive because they ain't so little as mice. George kind of always indulges Lenny in the end, right? George has clearly been caring for Lenny for a long time, and they're connected by people and places of their past. George verges on running out of patience with Lenny, but ultimately, in the end, he finds himself compelled to let Lenny have his way out of either pity or frustration or both. George starts heating up their supper of beans, and once again, Lenny says he likes his beans with ketchup, and George kind of gets a little short fuse and tells Lenny he always wants things that the two of them don't have. George again begins talking about how well he could live if he didn't have Lenny to look after, lamenting he can't spend his monthly wages on drinking and women. He chastises Lenny for losing them both every job George finds them, and for keeping them shoving all over the country in search of work. Even though George indulges Lenny as if he's a child, it's clear that George harbors a lot of resentment towards Lenny and the position in which Lenny puts them both. It's a constant struggle between wanting to shelter Lenny and wanting to be rid of him. So one of the driving forces behind George's decision-making throughout the novel is this balance, right? I could live so well if it were just me on my own, but he knows that he has to take care of Lenny because that's all Lenny has. George begins remembering about the incident that got them both kicked out of weed. Lenny wanted to feel the soft fabric of a girl's dress, but when Lenny touched her arm, she thought he was trying to assault her and jerked away. Lenny, frightened, held onto her arm, and the woman started screaming. This forces Lenny and George to both flee the town because there are people looking for them. The passage shows there are real consequences to Lenny's obsession with soft things. George is the only one with the patience to understand Lenny, but to the rest of the world, Lenny is a danger and a menace. George is often the only thing standing between Lenny and certain death. Lenny quietly says that he was just fooling about wanting ketchup and insists that if there were ketchup, he would give it all to George. He asks if he should go away and leave George alone. George apologizes for being mean and insists that he wants Lenny to stay with him. George adds that Lenny's Aunt Clara, though dead, wouldn't like Lenny being on his own. Lenny feels guilty on some level about this frustration he causes George. He's always offering to leave George alone and to let him be alone, but George is unable to cut ties with Lenny and selfishly puts himself first. Lenny asks George to tell him about the rabbits. George says he doesn't want to, but when Lenny begs to hear about them, of course, what does George do? Like he always does, he gives in. He begins describing the lonely lives of wandering ranch hands who ain't got nothing to look ahead to, but insists that he and Lenny are different because they have one another. When Lenny interjects, George tells Lenny he knows the speech by heart and should tell it himself. But Lenny wants George to be the one to tell about how it's going to be. This passage makes clear the fact that George has told the story a lot of times, and they've shared it so often that Lenny, in spite of the memory problems, like he didn't remember who his aunt was, and he didn't remember the trouble they got in Weed, right? But he remembers this kind of scripted dream that they have by heart. But it also suggests that Lenny likes hearing George imagine aloud a future in which they're still together. So he likes that part of it. George continues spinning the story about how someday he and Lenny will save up enough money to buy a little farm of livestock and rabbits. Of course, Lenny gets excited. It says they'll soon live off the fat of the land. That's a phrase that he says a lot. George continues describing an idyllic life in the countryside, which he and Lenny exist by simply enjoying the fruits of their own land and the company of some animals. George soon stops himself, insisting he hasn't got time to tell any more of the tale. Though George clearly likes indulging in this fantasy up to a certain point, the passage also suggests that it's so painful and uncomfortable for him, perhaps because he worries or because he knows it might not come true. As the men eat more beans, George quizzes Lenny by asking him what he's going to say tomorrow when the boss of the ranch starts asking him questions. Lenny replies that he's not going to say a word. George congratulates Lenny for remembering so well and tells him that if he continues behaving, he'll be allowed to tend the rabbits on their land someday. George kind of uses the dangling carrot of taking care of these rabbits over Lenny as like motivation and incentive, right? He's got a goal to reach for. Even though George seems to know that on some level he and Lenny might not reach the dream, it's still something to aspire to. It really suggests that their aspiration serves more as an escape rather than a concrete, attainable plan for the future, right? They're just dreaming. There's no real concrete plan because they know they might not be able to actually make it. George tells Lenny to remember the spot they're at right now. He urges Lenny to come straight here and hide in the brush if ever anything happens to get in trouble. George promises that if there's trouble, he'll come for Lenny and help him, but reminds him that if he does something bad, he won't be allowed to tend the rabbits. Lenny promises to stay out of trouble. This shows that George is nervous about their new job, right? He's so used to Lenny making mistakes that necessitate them leaving quickly that he's making an escape plan for them with the expectation that they're going to eventually need it. As the fire begins to die down, Lenny and George make small beds on the ground with their out of their bindles. They drift off to sleep, and Lenny imagines aloud about the many different colored rabbits he'll have one day. Lenny clings to the vision of rabbits as a symbol of the freedom from societal expectations and the judgment he'll one day enjoy over his and George's farm. That was part one. Let's take a look at part two, and then we'll be done for today. So, George and Lenny arrive at the ranch in part two. An old man named Kent. There's a lot of names here and a lot of C names, so it's kind of hard to keep them straight sometimes. Make sure you're taking notes. George and Lenny arrive at the ranch. An old man named Candy, who's missing a hand. Candy, that's how I remember. Shows them to their lodgings. The bunkhouse where all the laborers stay is basically a long rectangular building with 8 bunks consisting of straw beds and wall-mounted apple crates for storing their possessions. The room has a stove and a card table, and it's about 10 in the morning when they arrive. Candy tells George and Lenny that the boss was expecting them last night. The boss, Candy says, was sore as hell about the fact they weren't present and ready to work early in the morning. Candy is soon going to become George and Lenny's closest ally on the farm. From this passage alone, it's clear he wants to help them. Look out for them and warn them about any impending trouble that might be coming their way, no matter how large or small. George spots a yellow can of insect poison above his allotted bunk and asks Candy whether the beds are full of lice. Candy insists that the last man who occupied the bunk was a blacksmith who was positively obsessed with cleanliness and kept the repellent only as a precaution. George remains skeptical, but after inspecting the mattress closely, he decides to unpack his bindle and make up the bed. The passage demonstrates George's skepticism about his new surroundings. Even though working on a ranch will provide George and Lenny with necessary income, George is still looking for any excuse to escape and continue wandering in search of something better. Candy tells George and Lenny how angry the boss was that they didn't arrive to start the work earlier, and says that the boss took his rage out on all of them, especially the stable buck. George is amazed that even the stable hand, whose job is removed from their own, would catch hell for his lateness, but Candy, using a racial slur, informs him that the stable hand is the only black man on the ranch. Candy adds that in spite of the stable hand having a quiet, reserved disposition and a crooked back, due to being kicked by a horse long ago, the boss always takes his rage out on him due to his race. This demonstrates the unforgiving nature of a place which George and Lenny have found themselves. The boss is shown to be a cruel man who scapegoats the only black labor on the farm for the other ranch hands' failures. The term stable buck is an offensive racial slur for a black stable hand. This is clearly a world that is hostile to minorities and other marginalized people, which spells trouble for George and Lenny too. George asks more about what kind of guy the boss is. Candy insists he's pretty nice, except for when he's angry, and once even bought the laborers a whole gallon of whiskey to share on Christmas. The men were in such a good mood, Candy says, that they even let the stable hand celebrate with him, but the evening turned calamitous when one of the men began attacking him. The atmosphere at the ranch seems very eat or be eaten. Even though Candy himself is marginalized due to his missing hand, he knows he's still better off than the stable hand, who is doubly vulnerable due to his race and his physical disabilities. The door of the bunkhouse opens, and a little stocky man in jeans, flannel, and high-heeled boots and spurs, which prove he's not a laboring man, enters. George understands immediately that this man is the boss. The boss steps into the room and demands to see George and Lenny's work slips. He asks why the two of them weren't at the ranch earlier. George explains the bus driver let them out too early. He says they had to walk over 10 miles to the ranch. The boss asks for George and Lenny's full names. George introduces himself as George Milton, and Lenny says his name's Lenny Small. The boss's suspicious attitude towards George and Lenny suggests the level of scrutiny they'll be subjected to while working on the ranch. The boss runs a tight ship and lets nothing slip by him, demanding total control and submission from his workers. He's the boss, it's his way, or he gets to leave. The worker gets to leave. It's a no-nonsense attitude that reflects the really dire circumstances the men are facing due to the Great Depression, when exhibiting weakness for failing to do one's duties could very well lead to destitution or starvation. The boss asks Lenny why he doesn't speak for himself. George insists Lenny isn't a talker, but is as strong as a bull. Lenny echoes George and happily says he's as strong as a bull, and George gives Lenny a look. The boss asks Lenny what he can do as a worker. George answers that Lenny can do anything the boss needs. The boss asks why George won't let Lenny speak for himself. George replies that Lenny is not bright, but makes up for his lack of mental acuity and physical strength. The boss remains skeptical, demanding to know why George would take so much trouble for another guy, right? This is the Great Depression, everybody out for themselves. George insists that Lenny is his cousin and was kicked in the head by a horse as a child. George says he's been taking care of Lenny since his old lady died. The ranch is basically a microcosm of the landscape of the American West in the Great Depression. It's a very cutthroat dog-eat-dog world where every man is out for himself, and this boss is suspicious of two men actually looking out for one another. George has had to tread lightly as he navigates the fine line between explaining why he and Lenny need to travel together without making Lenny seem weak or like a liability. The boss is satisfied by this explanation, but warns George not to try and pull anything over on him. He says he's got his eyes on both Lenny and George, and he orders the men to start work after dinner with Slim's team. Slim, the boss says, is a skinner or mule driver. The boss takes his leave, but not before looking for a long moment at George and Lenny. It's kind of odd for these two men to kind of look out for each other the way George and Lenny do, especially in that time. So strange as to make them the targets of the boss's suspicion. After the boss leaves, George obviously gets mad at Lenny for talking. Lenny apologizes, insisting he forgot to stay quiet. George orders Lenny to remain quiet from now on. Lenny timidly asks George if he was really kicked in the head once and if they are really cousins. George replied that even if he was Lenny's blood kin, he'd shoot himself. George gets obviously frustrated with Lenny's dependence and worried by his inability to remember the truth of the connection between them. It's clear that although George cares for Lenny and he wants to protect him, he also realizes putting his friend first may put George himself at a risk. Candy goes to the front door and opens it. Candy's standing there with an old, blind, and lame sheepdog. George accuses Candy of eavesdropping. Candy insists he wasn't listening in and was just petting his dog. The dog kind of drags himself into the bunkhouse and sits down and starts licking itself. George marvels at the dog's rough shape. Candy says that he had the dog since he was a puppy and that he was a great sheep herder in his prime. Candy and his dog are the symbol of the relationship between George and Lenny. Just as Candy can't bring himself to abandon his dog or put the thing out of its misery, George can't find it within himself to separate from Lenny, even though he knows that Lenny is becoming more and more of a liability. Next, a young man with sun-browned skin and curly hair comes into the bunkhouse. He has a glove on his left hand and is wearing high-heeled boots just like the boss. He asks Candy if he has seen his old man, and Candy, addressing the man as Curly, says the boss has gone to the cookhouse. Curly approaches Lenny and asks if he and George are the men the boss has been waiting on. George says they've just arrived, but Curly urges him to let the big guy talk. Lenny quietly echoes George's statement that the two of them have just arrived. Curly warns Lenny to answer when spoken to and kind of storms out. This is our first introduction to our, at least the most of antagonists we have in the story. It's Curly, the boss's son. Kind of echoes his dad's introduction a little bit earlier. The ranch is a very unforgiving place, and people like Lenny, people who are different, are suspect and liable to be singled out, right? You'll see that Curly has a bit of a little man's complex as well. He seems that he has to go pick on the toughest guy in the room to let everybody know that he isn't weak. Candy tells the men that Curly is the boss's son. Candy says that he's like a lot of little guys, that he wants to show dominance over bigger men. Candy says men like Curly never fight fair. If he wins a fight against a big guy, everyone will talk about how surprisingly strong he is. But if he loses that same fight, everyone will talk about how unfair the advantage was. George says that Curly had better watch himself. Lenny is big and strong and don't know no rules. Okay, a little foreshadowing there. That's going to foreshadow the conflict between Curly and Lenny and George. Curly seems hungry for a fight, and while George wants to protect his and Lenny's new position, he doesn't plan to take any crap from Curly, or let Lenny do so either. If you don't stand up for yourself, you get walked on, is kind of the feeling. George and Candy sit down at the card table and begin shuffling up a deck. Candy selectively tells George that Curly has been in rare form lately. He got married a couple of weeks ago and has been cockier than ever, recently in an attempt to show off for his wife. Curly's wife, Candy whispers, has got the eye. In other words, she's a little flirtatious and has been making eyes at Slim and a worker named Carlson ever since moving to the ranch. Candy's gossip about Curly's wife and the unstable relationship between the two of them foreshadows even more calamity on the ranch. It suggests that the weaknesses of people's underlying insecurities, instability, and suspicion could easily take over the outwardly strong and stoic demeanors they put forth. Candy stands up, says he's got to get ready. The wash basins for the men coming in from the fields. He asks George to keep their conversation confidential, and George promises he will. After Candy leaves, George warns Lenny to be careful around Curly. If Curly and Lenny tangle, Lenny and George will both get the boot. Lenny insists he will do whatever it takes to avoid trouble. George reminds Lenny of the plan they made should trouble arise. Lenny says he remembers. He should go and hide in the brush. More foreshadowing. The tension between that George really feels all around the ranch, right? The boss's son. He doesn't want to rock the boat, but he's kind of been here before, and he gets ready for any troubles with the plan because of Lenny, and he knows how it can always go wrong. George hears someone calling for the stable hand, and when he looks up in the doorway, he sees a beautiful girl in heavy makeup, a house dress, and red shoes standing there. Her hair is curled, and her fingernails are painted red. She says she's looking for Curly. George kind of shyly tells her, without looking in her direction, that Curly just left the bunkhouse a minute ago. When Slim comes by, Curly's wife greets him flirtatiously and says she's trying to find Curly. Slim says she isn't trying very hard. He's just seen the man go into the ranch house. Curly's wife bids the laborers goodbye and hurries away. This introduction of Curly's wife demonstrates that Candy's earlier warnings were true. It seems she's clearly looking to stir up trouble, or at least get herself some attention, without any consideration for what her actions might mean for the men with whom she's toying. After she's gone, George calls Curly's wife a tramp, but Lenny insists that she's purty. George warns Lenny never to say anything like that again, and Lenny begs George to let the two of them leave, stating he has a bad feeling about the ranch. George insists they should stay until they get a stake in the property, but he admits himself he would like to leave. George is spooked by Lenny having them gotten into trouble with a woman in Weed, the last town they were in, and he's worried that the same thing's going to happen here. Lenny also seems worried about the potential for disaster. But George knows if they pick up and move, they'll be further from achieving that dream of stability of their farm of the rabbits. Slim enters the bunkhouse. He's a grave, strong man with an ageless face. He sits down across the card table from George, who's lazily playing solitaire. He asks George if he and Lenny are the new guys and whether they travel around together. George says they do. He must take care of the slow Lenny. Slim says not many guys travel around together and laments that everybody in the whole damn world is scared of each other. Slim, like the boss, is kind of surprised to see George and Lenny's friendship and mutual care for each other, but rather than expressing suspicion, he expresses something like envy. He suggests that despite, or maybe perhaps because of, the rough environment of these laborers' lives in the American West, many men are looking for companionship despite their initial skepticism and reservation toward trusting others. A large man with a big stomach comes into the bunkhouse. Slim introduces him to George and Lenny as Carlson. Carlson asks Slim whether his dog had her litter of puppies yet, and Slim says she gave birth last night. 9 puppies were born, he says, though he drowned 4 of them for fear she wouldn't be able to feed them all. Carlson says that Slim should do Candy a favor and shoot his lame, smelly old dog and give him one of the puppies to raise. Before Slim can answer, the dinner bell rings. Slim and Carlson hurry to leave the bunkhouse. All right, so the potential for Slim's dog's new puppies to replace Candy's old, lame dog mirror George's underlying and forbidden desire to rid himself of Lenny and focus only on getting ahead. Lenny excitedly asked George if he heard the men talking about the puppies, and if George can ask Slim to give Lenny a brown and white puppy. George tries to calm Lenny down by urging him to hurry up and wash for dinner. Curly enters the bunkhouse again and demands to know whether the men have seen his wife. George says she was at the bunkhouse looking for Curly. Curly asks which way she went, and George replies that he doesn't know because he didn't watch her go. Curly hurries out the door. Just as Curly's wife seems to be looking in on the men as a provocation, Curly demands the men to know whether they've seen it as a deliberate trap. George knows how to handle the situation. He's calm and he's cool for now. George and Lenny leave the bunkhouse, and George confides in Lenny that he himself is worried about tangling with Curly someday. Candy's dog remains in the bunkhouse alone, raising its head for a moment when it senses someone at the door again. It's Curly, who pops his head in quickly before jerking it out again. Candy's dog senses trouble but can't directly look it in the face, just as Lenny knows something is wrong on the ranch but is uncertain of what it is and prepared to avoid trouble for now. That is the end of part 2. Alright. That should take you through at least all these questions on sections 1 and 2. Let's make sure we get those done. What else was I? Oh, one more thing. Your flip grid for today is in. It is the daily check-in. Let me show you. Daily check-in for today. Let's go back. I have 12 videos from yesterday. Considering there are about 24 of you in class, that means half of us didn't get those done. If you didn't get yours done yesterday, do that first, please. And then you can start whatever you need to within your novel groups. Novel groups, make sure you're meeting in them right after we finish this lecture. I can actually see, remember, I can see when your group met, for how long, and exactly who was there. Make sure that you are meeting for the hour so I can give you credit for attendance. If you don't yet have one, send me a message in chat and I will make sure that I find you a group. Unless we have any questions, that's going to be it. You can go ahead and start in your novel groups. Nothing? All right. Into your novel groups.